Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here on such a beautiful fall day. You get to come in this dark room where we close all the blinds and flip the projector on, so we really appreciate it. And we're 18 days out right now from a pretty big election, so we're very grateful that all of you guys are here in this room and are going to be willing to give your services on Election Day. So how many people have not worked before? Have you never worked? Oh, wow, good. This is amazing. Well, thank you. Again, it's a really important job. And by the way, I'm Justin Roebuck. I'm your county clerk. This is Steve Daitch. He is our elections coordinator, and he really runs our training operation as well as the election operation in my office for the county. So we're very busy right now. It's been a busy couple of months gearing up for the November election, but just a couple of things that I would say as we're going into this cycle. We're seeing numbers, when we look at our absentee ballot numbers coming in at the county level, we've got almost 30,000 absentee ballots already out, and that's a significant sign. I mean, that's a sign of greater interest than normal in this election. We have predicted a couple of times already that we're likely to see more of a presidential-sized turnout than a normal midterm election. And I don't know that it will be as big as we had in 2016, but I think as we gear up for it, that's kind of what we can expect. And so one of the things that Steve and I have been really working on is communicating with our local clerks, with your chair people who are going to be in the precincts, to make sure that they're kind of more aware of some of the interesting challenges that we're going to have in this election. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about some of that stuff too, but the work that you guys do is so critically important because honestly, you're typically the only face of our whole election operation that the average voter is going to see. We have 200,000 voters in Ottawa County. There's about 1,000 election workers in Ottawa County. And to them, you are the election, and that's why it's so important what you're doing. And I know you're giving up time from your days, and this is not, this is not a celebrity kind of job, right, that you're doing. This is a tough task, and you're working long hours, and we just are very, very grateful for it. So for this training, I think everybody should have received a manual, correct? So our election inspector manual is really what we're going to be going through today. Sort of step by step, the procedural manual, but the intention is that you can make notes in this. You can take this with you to the precinct if this is helpful for you. We've got a lot of photos in there. Steve's done a fantastic job in putting that together with the help of a lot of our local clerks and their input as well. We have the equipment set up as well. You can feel free. Steve will be demoing on it a little bit today, but we feel free to come up even afterwards if you want to kind of play around with it a little bit and see what it's like, as a lot of you guys have probably not experienced that if you're new. So the other thing we're trying for the first time today is we are recording this session. We've really been moving into better use of our technology at the county to try to find ways that we can reach out to more of you guys, whether it's creating little YouTube videos on snippets of our training or recording the entire session and seeing what we can do with this. So we get to wear this really cool lanyard thing that there's a camera in the back that's like tracking me as I'm moving. And I have to talk into this microphone, and I'll pass the baton to Steve in a minute. But so that's the purpose for this cool necklace that I'm wearing. And hopefully that will be a useful resource for all of you guys as well. So I think that's about it in terms of introduction. I'm sure I'm going to kick it over to Steve, and then we'll kind of tag team it from here. But thank you again for being here, and look forward to it. It's going to be a fun 5 hours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. And
should I do this?
I'll be anointed.
Medal?
Yeah. That seems right. That just feels right. Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for being out here this afternoon. Like Justin said, we really appreciate everything that you guys do for the elections, and there's a lot to learn. And I know a lot of you are brand new to the process, so I appreciate your time to come out and see everything that there is to know with the election process. So I am going to really focus heavily on the manual today. So I want to make sure that everybody did sign in the back. If you didn't, you can get a chance during the training today to get up and sign the sign-in sheet. If your name wasn't on the sign-in sheet, that's fine. We just need to know your name and which jurisdiction you're working for. Also, you should have picked up a copy of the manual. I think it looks like pretty much everybody did. There are plenty of copies in the back if you still need one. If you've received one of these before, we did just make some changes to this. So this has been updated. There is a date on the bottom of the cover that shows you when we revised this manual. So if you have an old one, that's where you'll be able to know the difference between the two. Just kind of moved some things around, added a couple of sections to it, but by and large, the bulk of the information is the same as the previous manual. So I do want to go through a few just general things with the manual before we really kick this off. I'm mostly going to be using the manual for the training today. I'm going to project the manual. We'll zoom in on certain sections of it, and then you'll also have that in front of you. Also at each, not quite at each table, but at each of the long tables, we have some sets of election materials. So these are things that will come in a canvas blue bag in your precinct. And we'll be referring to these things throughout the training. We also have pictures of everything that we'll be talking about in the manual as well. So on the first page of the manual, we have the table of contents. And the way that this is organized is into 3 units. So before the polls open, election day procedures, and after the polls close. At the very bottom of that first page, there's Unit 4, Special Procedures. We typically go over those items with our precinct chairs. We have a couple of days of chair training coming up, and those are the items, kind of weird things in the precincts, problems with what happens when a voter is not on the voter rolls, those sorts of things that we want to make sure that our chairs are aware of. We'll kind of skip over a few of those sections today and talk about them more generally for this class. Today, we're mostly going to be focusing on the management of your precinct. So all of the things that are actually happening on election day. And then one thing too, before I get too far ahead, there is coffee and water in the back, and there's also restrooms out and to the left of the hallway. We won't have a formal break during the training today, but feel free to get up and move around at any time. Also, as I'm going through the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any point. There's a lot of information, and I tend to move through this stuff pretty quickly. I tend to speak in election jargon too. So if I'm not making any sense, to you, I'm probably not making any sense to anyone else. So feel free to stop me and ask any questions. With that in mind, I am going to go over a few key terms that we will be using a few times today. So just to go over some of these, the first couple here are AV and AVCB. Those refer to the absentee voters and absentee voter counting boards. Do we have anybody in here who's working in an absentee counting board? We have a couple? Okay. All right. Great. So we do have sections of the manual that go over absentee ballots and how to process those. There's a couple of different ways, but we'll largely be focusing on the precinct in this particular training. Also on here is election inspectors. Election inspectors, that refers to all of you. So that is everybody from our precinct chairs to our absentee counting boards. Everybody is an election inspector, and this is the terminology used by the state for everybody who's working in the election. Underneath that is the electronic poll book. That is a laptop that has your complete voter list on it. The electronic poll book is going to be used to issue ballots. We'll talk quite a bit about that during the training today. A couple other things that I want to skip to are the scan and the touch writer. And so for those of you who've been to one of our trainings relatively recently, or if you voted in the August primary election, you may have seen our new election equipment. So we have 2 devices, the scan and the touch writer. The scan has a blue S sticker at the top. The touch writer has a black W sticker on the top of that. And these 2 devices do 2 different things. The main device that every voter who comes in the precinct will use is the scan. They'll have their paper ballot, they'll fill it out, and they'll run it through this machine. This is what's actually counting the votes. You can see the black ballot box here. This is already set up. There are some setup instructions in the manual, but I won't be going over the setup of this. Largely that will either fall onto someone else who's working the precinct, your clerks, or sometimes other city or township staff that helps set up the equipment on election day. This is the touch writer. This device is compliant with federal guidelines for allowing an independent a voter who has a disability to mark a ballot independently in the precinct. This is largely for voters who have a visual impairment. So there are Braille controls on here. It can read a full audio ballot to the voter. And this device can be used to print a full double-sided ballot off of the ballot printer. So the ballot printer, you can see there's extremely long paper in the ballot printer. We'll kind of demo this in a little bit. That paper is just blank ballot stock that gets printed with the voter's marks on the ballot, and then that gets run through the scan tabulator in order to actually count that voter's votes. So those are a couple of pieces of equipment that I'll be talking about quite a bit today. And then also at the bottom here, this phrase V-Drive. A V-Drive is a small black USB stick, and actually I think I have one that I can show real quick. So this is already installed in the devices, so I can't take it out of there until we shut the machines down. But it's just a small black USB stick. This stores all of the data for the election. So every single thing is on here, whether it's which ballot to print on the touch writer or which ballots to accept on the scan. So this is where all of our vote data is at the end of election day as well. So in your manual, starting on page 4, there are several pages where we are go over the setup of the equipment. You can definitely feel free to look at this for your information. This is on pages 4 through, I believe, about page 15. And I'm going to skip over this for now, but a couple of quick troubleshooting things that you all can be aware of. This is the equipment set up properly. The ballot box does collapse. So does this table that the touch writer is sitting on. And that just needs to be set up before you can do anything else. If there are problems with powering on your equipment on election day, it might be a little bit hard to see from a distance, but there's this brick, a power brick here. If this is plugged into the wall and working properly, there's a little green light on the power brick. So just make sure that that's plugged in. A very common error is that it's not plugged in to the cord. So this power cord that it's connected to needs to be seated in there just right in order for that to be connected. So that's one thing on that. I will skip ahead here. And we're going to start on page 15 with before the polls open. So the very first thing that we're going to do is take the oath of office. Is everybody in here working the full day? Do we have anybody who's coming in later in the day? A couple people? Okay. So for those of you who are going to be working later in the day, you still have to take the oath of office. And you sign in on the front cover of your poll book. The precinct chairs will give you the oath of office, and this is true for everybody. If you're there first thing in the morning, this is going to be the first thing that you do. You take the oath of office, and you sign the front cover of the poll book. If you come in later in the day, if you're starting a second shift, then you'll sign at the bottom of this page, but you still sign the front cover of the poll book. You're still being issued the oath of office by the precinct chair. After you take the oath of office, you're going to go through your materials, make sure that you have everything that you need. This is going to vary quite a bit by precinct. Every jurisdiction's a little bit different. They have some different instructions and different, sometimes different materials that you need in each precinct. But by and large, the things that you're going to have and that you're going to need to be accounting for are your ballots, your equipment, your scan and touch writer, your ballot printer that's connected to the touch writer, your voting booths, your e-poll book laptop, and your precinct kit. There may be other materials provided by your clerk, and your precinct kit's going to include a lot of different things. There's a set of envelopes that are up on everybody's table. There's also some seals and certificates that you'll have. All of those things are going to be used throughout the day on Election Day. So the next thing I'm going to go over is the e-poll book. Does anybody know if they're working the e-poll book station on Election Day? I'm always curious if a couple? Okay. All right. Well, I'll go through this relatively quickly then. There is a section of the e-poll book. We want to make sure that we get the laptop up and running. This is going to be, needs to be fully operational before we can issue ballots to voters. So we want to make sure that we open that up, make sure everything's working right, and then we're going to log into the e-poll book, go to the report section, click on ballot summary, and then we're going to enter our ballot numbers into the ballot summary. The clerk is going to deliver a stack of ballots to the precinct. This is going to start with the first ballot after absentee ballots have been issued. So your first ballot number is actually not going to be the number 1. It's going to be somewhere after that. We've had a lot of absentees in this election, so very well maybe 400 may be your first ballot number for Election Day. We're only accounting for the ballots that are delivered to the precinct on Election Day. So you're going to put your starting number and your ending number. So let's say you have 1,500 ballots in your precinct. You're starting at ballot number 400, and then your ending number will be ballot number 1,500, somewhere in there. So you'll actually physically check the stubs on your ballot and put those numbers into the e-poll book here. That will then total up your total number of ballots. If you have multiple different ballot styles in your precinct, which is pretty common, then your ballot numbers, you'll put in a different line for each ballot style. So your A ballot split, you'll put the total number of ballots delivered for that split. For your B split, you'll put in the total number of ballots for that. Why might you have a ballot split in a precinct? Does anybody know? I think Justin might know. Yes. Do you want to answer it? Okay. I just got excited to not speak for a second. So for ballot splits, you might have a ballot split in your precinct if you have 2 school districts that fall into your precinct, which is pretty common. In let's see, Crockery Township, we have several splits in Precinct 1. In our cities, we don't typically have splits. So if you're in City of Holland, City of Grand Haven, there's not typically a split in those precincts. And it's typically a school district. That's the reason for that. So if you're in the let's see, Georgetown area, you may be split between Hudsonville schools and Jenison schools, that sort of thing. So we just have to account for each of those ballot numbers. Then on page 17, we are verifying the seals and serial numbers on the devices. In your manual there's a close-up picture that's kind of the back page of the manual. Or no, that's the front page of the manual, I'm sorry. This has changed, actually, to update that picture. So on the front page of the manual, there's a section there for the serial number of each device and also the seal number for each device. Your serial number is on a gray sticker that's on the top of each of the devices, and that's where that arrow is pointing in your book, and that's what that picture is of. That's just on the top of these devices. Your seal number is going to be locking these doors. So there's a couple of doors here that hold the memory card for the election. That's where that V drive goes. And this is what's going to be sealed up on Election Day. So this needs to be sealed. If it's been tampered with at all, that's something where you have to call your clerk right away if either of these numbers don't match the materials that you've been given. It's especially important that you check the serial numbers because we want to make sure that the right device has been delivered to your precinct. So if you're in a jurisdiction that has multiple precincts, it's possible that You're in precinct 4, and precinct 5's equipment is in your precinct. So you want to make sure that that's all been delivered to the right place and that nothing's been tampered with. So this is a picture of the seal. This is exactly how it will look on election day. We went around and tested every piece of equipment for this election, and we use these blue plastic seals that cover that door. So that's what you'll be looking for when you're verifying that serial number, or the seal number. To open the polls, this is pretty easy on this equipment, but there are a few steps I can demonstrate here. One thing that I want to touch on too is as soon as you take the oath of office, the next thing should be powering on your equipment. So if this still needs to be set up, that's something we have to do right away. I can tell you from somewhat painful experience that this takes a really long time to load. So you want to be sure to do this as early as possible. If you press the power button on the back of the machine right at 6:59, you're not going to be ready for voters at 7. So that's one of the first things that we need to do in order to be sure that we can open the doors at 7 o'clock and start taking voters in. On the screen here, and then also in your book, you can see that where it says Print Zero Report. That's going to be the first screen that you see on the tabulator. It's very important that it's on this screen, and that under here it says ballots. That ballot number needs to be 0 on your tabulator. The reason why is we went around and we tested ballots. We tested about 45 ballots on each piece of equipment, and then we cleared out those ballots. So we want to make sure that none of those test ballots are still sitting on the equipment. They've all been cleared out. They should all be on this screen ready to go on election day. When you see the Print Zero Report button, you can just touch that, and that will print the zero report for your precinct. Now, for those of you who are working in an absentee counting board, those tapes are going to be horrendously long. The tapes in the precincts are still going to be pretty long, but if you have multiple precincts printing on the same tape, it's going to be a very long tape. So we're going to let this print fully. And then once we have that printed, everybody who is present when the polls opens must sign that tape. So you're going to be doing a lot of signing at the end of the night and a little bit in the morning. So first thing, you sign the oath of office. You also sign your zero report. And all of that is on your manual here. Once you get your tape printed, you're going to leave it right where it is for now. And then you can hit the Open Polls button. So your Open Polls code for this election, your chairs will have this, your clerks will have this information. This is the code for this election is the 6-digit election date. So that's 110618. So for this one, I have a mock election set up here, so it's slightly different. So I'm going to go ahead and open the polls. You can see that I left the tape on here. This is printed with signature lines where you can sign. And after the polls are open, we have this screen comes on. Your runway lights on the machine go from red to green, and this is ready to go. We still have this tape dangling out the front of this machine, though. We want to hide that so that we're anticipating a busy day. We don't want somebody to tear that off and think that's their voting receipt or something. This is important, and we want it to stay connected. So actually what we're going to do is once this is flashing green and it's ready to go, we're going to pop this door open, and there goes my totals tape. And then we're going to take this out. We're going to re-roll the tape and put it back into the cartridge, the compartment here. You can see here we ran out of tape on this one, so I'll have to grab more. So for this, for all of your precincts on election day, you have a fresh roll of tape. So it shouldn't be an issue, but if you have to change the tape, it's very easy to do. Again, you just kind of pop that open and drop the tape in there, and it just has to go underhand. Thank you. That's all right. Yeah. It is, yes. It is. Yep, that's a good question. So the code that I gave you for this is 110618. It's the same code that you're going to use on the touch writer if a voter needs to use this device. Yeah, very good question. So you can see the steps here for changing the tape. And also, this is the same procedure for popping the tape out and re-rolling it. One thing I do want to emphasize is on election day, we're going to have our zero report, and then we're going to pop it out, roll it back up, and hide it in that compartment. It leads to potentially, I haven't had anybody do this yet, but the main thing that I'm worried about is printing the results tape over our zero report. So we don't want to do that. So at the end of the night, it's pretty easy to avoid. All you have to do is just, when you reinstall the tape, you're just going to unroll this past the point where it's printed. So it's pretty easy to avoid, but it is something I want to highlight. So then once the tape's rolled up, this is ready for voters. On the touch writer, opening the polls is actually quite a bit different. The devices are very similar. They work in very much the same way, but the way that we test them is actually quite different. So that leads to a slight difference in how you open the polls. On this device, as you can see, you have multiple options where it says print zero report, print configuration readiness, print precincts enabled, and open the polls. On this device, and just this device, we don't need a zero report. So this is quite different from the other machine. We actually don't need any of the reports that are printing on this. We don't have to sign any of those reports. This device is essentially an extra voting booth. This is for voters, to help voters mark a ballot, where this device is actually counting the votes. So Michigan election law really focuses more heavily on the device that's counting the votes versus a device that's simply a voting booth, something to help voters. So on here, we won't print the zero report. We're just going to hit open the polls. And this is going to be our same election day code. And it's much harder to do from behind it like this. I would recommend actually using it right. Okay, so this will open the polls. It will print a short report, and we can discard that report once the polls are opened. Also on the touch writer, there is that second piece of equipment that we need to make sure is operational, and that is our printer. The ballot printer is sitting right next to the touch writer, so we want to make sure that that is plugged in both to the power and also connected via USB cord to the touch writer. So you can see on the touch writer right now, this is ready for voters. It's on this blue screen, and it's asking for an access code, something I'll talk about in a second. If that is not connected properly to the printer, that screen is going to change. And this will change to say, contact a poll worker for assistance to resolve touch here. I really wish I could change what it says on that button, because if you touch here on the screen, it doesn't help you at all. It's completely worthless. The only thing that you can do is check your connections to the printer. Make sure it's powered on. If it's not powered on, make sure it's turned on. If it is powered on, first thing you can do is turn it off, turn it back on, see if that reconnects it. Also, you want to make sure that your USB cord is plugged in to both the printer and to the touch writer. Now, I'm going to reinstall this. And when I do, this is going to take it about 30 seconds, or not quite that long. And then it popped back on. So it's ready for voters again. So we just want to check those connections, check the power on the printer if that's bringing up an error message. Yeah, absolutely.
I know this is set up for accessibility for a wheelchair or a scooter, but many people who are in that situation don't need that kind of voting booth. Will those still be the lowered ones in every precinct?
Oh, that's a really good question. So yeah, while this is accessible, it is accessible for a wheelchair, like you were saying. A regular voting booth should be available. Every precinct is different. We actually don't set up the precincts at the county. That's up to local jurisdictions. But I do know that most jurisdictions have either a regular tabletop or a lower voting booth available. Mhm. It does not take the place of it. No, it really is more for voters who have difficulty filling out a ballot. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
I'm brand new, and now I'm not gonna be expected to go in and do this stuff. I mean, basically, the clerk and the chair people are gonna have most of this done, and I'm just gonna do what they tell me. That's what I'm thinking.
I think I'm. It's always good advice to do what your clerk tells you. I know I follow that advice with all 23 of them, so it's definitely a good idea. So to your question, for those of you who are new, a lot of this you'll probably have one particular job on election day. So there are different stations in the precinct. So this is so this will be so this really will be this kind of information is more general for you to be aware of, but it will be most of this work will actually fall onto the chair, especially when it comes to assisting voters. The chair will be involved. The clerks may be involved. Just depends on your precinct setup, and a lot of oh sure, yeah, a lot of jurisdictions haven't quite set that yet. So once you have, you'll have a specific task on the polls on election day. Yeah, very good question. So up on the screen, you can see where it says ready to open polls. You hit open polls, enter the code, and then where it says enter your access code, that's when the touch writer is on enter your access code, that's when you know that this is actually ready for voters. The access code doesn't exist yet. We actually have to create this. That's a security feature of this device because it does have the capability of printing any number of ballots. So this can print a live ballot, it can print a blank ballot, it can print voted ballots. So we need some way to control how this device actually works. So that's where the access code comes from. So we will go over how to actually issue that code, and that is on page 21 of your manual. So it's fairly simple to do, although this is something that took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around. It's not a very intuitive process. But the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to touch the blue button on the back of the device. You can see up on the screen there's a picture of that. And I'm just going to hit that here. So for those of you who can see the screen, this page changes slightly. It goes from kind of a lighter blue to a darker blue. I do kind of wish that this had a more distinct difference between those two pages, because both of them are blue-ish pages with numbers on them. But once you hit the poll worker code, it will change to the screen. And then you'll hit, so this is actually, I'm sorry, this is what you'll do at the beginning of the day. So in order to issue an access code, you're going to enter your access code on this screen, and then there's something highlighted in blue that says create access code. So that's how you actually vote on the device. What we're instructing our chairs to do first thing in the morning is what the instructions on the screen are telling you. This is, we're going to hit the menu button on the top of the screen, and we're going to test to make sure that this device is working properly. So we want to make sure that the printer is hooked up, that it's printing a ballot. So what we're going to do next is just print a test page. So from the main menu screen, we hit Run Tests. And then we're going to hit Print Thermal Test Page, or no, Print Laser Test Page. The thermal printer is your receipt tape printer. Print Laser Test Page. And then this is going to produce a test page on the printer. So when the printer is ready to print, it's going to actually flash up an error message here. So it says wrong paper size on the screen here. It's giving you an error message. The printer is flashing orange. This is actually going to happen on every time we need to print from this device for this election, because it's taking a longer paper size. So we just need to tell the printer to print from the manual feed tray. So I just hit the OK button on the top of the printer here, and that tells the printer to load the paper from the manual feed tray. And it printed our test page. So we know that this is working. We know that the paper is loaded properly, so everything is working on the printer, and that's ready to go for voters. So then we can, oh, that's a good question. So the test page itself, once this prints, this is going to go into the local clerk's envelope. So there are 3 envelopes in your precinct kits that receive materials at the end of the day. One is the local clerk envelope, one is the Board of Canvassers envelope, and one is the county clerk envelope. You also will have a VAT ballot storage envelope. This envelope is for the touchwriter. VAT is another election jargon term that means voter assist terminal. That's the generic name for the touchwriter. There are 3 different systems in use in Michigan. So they have, so the state has developed this sort of generic terminology. So that's where this green envelope comes from. The VAT ballot storage envelope is only for ballots that are being issued to voters who are using the touchwriter. And I'll kind of explain that in a second. Your test page, though, is going to go into your local clerk envelope. So once your machine is tested and ready to go, then we can open it for voters. And there are instructions on the screen here for exactly how to test the printer on here as well. So there's some pictures of exactly how to do that test ballot process. On page 22, you can see the screen, a section at the bottom of the screen that shows up both on the scan and the touchwriter when you're in the menu screen for either device. Something to be aware of is the time, date, and the number of ballots on the machine. So the time and date should be set. Justin and I was part of the testing procedures. We actually set this with daylight savings in mind. So that is November 4th, so just before the election. So we fell back already on our equipment. So far I haven't been an hour early everywhere, but it still works out. So you want to make sure that the time and date is correct there. And then the ballot number. The ballots are going to be different on these 2 devices. So I said earlier, it's very important that the number of ballots on the scan is 0. And that's absolutely true. We need this to be 0 because we don't want to have any test data messing up our election day data. For our touchwriter, though, this doesn't count votes. It's only a counter. That ballot number is only a counter of how many pieces of paper this is printed. And unfortunately, we don't have a way to clear that from testing. So on the touchwriter at the bottom, the number of ballots there will be, it will vary quite a bit. It may be just 2, it may be as many as 10 or 15. And that's okay. None of those are ballots that are going to be counted. None of those are vote totals. Those are simply the number of ballots printed from the printer for this election in order to test the device. So that's a significant difference. Also up on the screen, you can see where it says lifetime. The lifetime number is the total number of ballots that have ever been run on these machines. So on the scans, after this election, it could be very interesting. We'll see where our largest precincts are. We'll see where our heaviest turnout is because we have this lifetime ballot counter. So if you see that there's 1,000 ballots that have already been run on your scan, make sure that that is the lifetime counter. It's okay if it's the lifetime counter. Definitely not okay if it's the regular ballot counter. So make sure that that's 0 on your tabulator. Then you also want to make sure that the battery and power indicators are both green. If those have a red line through them, that means that something's not connected. And you want to just check your power cables to make sure that everything's working properly. If there is a line through the battery, that's something that can be reconnected. You just have to power the device off and then unseat the tablet, and that can be fixed. So we don't want to do that during election day. If at all possible, we want to try to check these indicators long before the polls open. So one of the first things that we do on election day. Okay. Any questions on the setup of these devices at the moment? Okay. We are still in the before the polls open section, so I'll get to more details about actually voting on this equipment when we start talking about actual election day procedures. So I'm just going to keep going through the first unit here still, talking about some of those basic setup pieces. So the next thing on page 22 is the precinct setup. And on page, let's see, thank you. So on page 49 in your manual, there is a sample precinct setup. And this is very generic. This is going to look different in every jurisdiction. We have jurisdictions that are in gymnasiums. We have jurisdictions that feel like they're in closets. So each precinct is going to be different. But essentially, you're going to have an entrance, and then that will lead straight to your application to vote station. If you're working at the application to vote station, voters are going to be filling out a small application. They put down their name, address, and date of birth, and then they take that over to the poll book station. So that's your first stop. You have to fill out some information. Then you take that over to station 2. At station 2, the e-poll book station, your name should appear on the e-poll book. Whoever's checking in that voter will check them in on the laptop and issue that voter the ballot. There'll be the next ballot in sequential order. So the next number will be issued to that voter. Then station 3 I have on here is the help desk. Every precinct should have an area where the precinct chair can take a voter aside if they need to do some additional work. So for instance, if the voter's not on the polls, then if the voter's not on the poll list, we want to do some investigating. So that's a place where the voter can fill out some paperwork if there's some additional material that we need to do for that particular voter. Station 4 over here is, of course, our voting booths. So our voting booths should be set up in a place where no one can see how anyone is voting. So if you're set up, for instance, if we had a precinct set up in this room, if we had a voting booth right here, we'd want it so the voter is facing this way in the back of the voting booths here voting instead of the opposite, because we don't want somebody to be able to see over their shoulder and see how that voter's voting. Station 5 is the tabulator station, and that's where this device will be. Your touch writer will be over with the voting booths. So this should be somewhere closer to the voting booths, and this device is going to be kind of on its own. A worker is going to be stationed here in order to tear off the stubs of the ballots, collect up both the stub and the voter's application to vote, and then the voter will take their ballot, which is contained in a secrecy sleeve, and put this into the tabulator on their own. So there's just somebody at this station. They need to be about 10 feet away from the tabulator at all times, but there is somebody stationed here in case a voter needs assistance. Also, at the bottom of this diagram, we have a public viewing area. Public viewing area is for anybody who's interested in seeing what's going on in the precinct on Election Day. All of our precincts, actually all precincts across the country, are public places on Election Day. So anyone can come in and view the process. We'll go over some of the intricacies of that with our precinct chairs, but just generally, there are two different types of people who can view an election, and in election terminology, those are called poll watchers and poll challengers. Poll watcher is simply somebody who is a member of the public, and they are interested in what's going on, and they can be in the public viewing area really at the discretion of the precinct chair. Poll challenger has a little bit different amount of rights and responsibilities. These can be, typically they're members of the political parties. They're often looking for their voters. They're checking names off of a list. They're trying to get their voters out to vote. So that's by and large what the parties do on Election Day in the precinct. If you have a poll challenger at your precinct, they do need to check in with the precinct chair. They also can't handle any materials, but they can view the materials, including the poll book. And the reason why they can view the poll book is to check off names, make sure that their list is coming out to vote. So I am going to hop back to page 23. Let's see here. Okay, so we're going to start up on Unit 2, Election Day Procedures, page 23. So at this point, it is 7 o'clock, and we announce that the polls are open by saying, hear ye, the polls are now open. Since you all are new, that will probably fall on all of you. We don't get a lot of hazing opportunities in elections, so we try to take what we can get. So the first thing that a voter is going to do on election day is come in to that first station, to station 1, the application to vote station. And you can see a copy of the application to vote, thank you, on page 48. And there's 2 sides of this small document. It's just a small piece of paper, and the voters are placing their name, signature, date of birth, and current address on here. One note on the back of the application is that if a voter does not have a photo ID, they can sign the back of this document, stating essentially that they don't have an ID on them and that they are swearing that their statements are true so that their information is accurate. Even though they don't have an ID, they can still be issued a ballot simply by filling out this form. So we'll kind of flip back and forth between the 2 of those over the next section. We're going to talk about photo ID. You can see in the box in the upper right-hand corner here that we're really only looking for 2 things on the photo ID. And we only can look for 2 things on the photo ID. This is the voter's name and their photo. That's all we're verifying. There are lots of instances when a voter may have a different address on their ID than they do in the poll book, and that's acceptable. That is absolutely fine. As long as the voter puts their address down on the application to vote, then that's okay. There's many different reasons why a voter may have an old or out-of-date address on their driver's license, so that's not something that can keep somebody from voting. That's a good question. So the question was, is that really only in Michigan, or is that true in other states? It's different in every state. I wish I had a better answer. And this also causes confusion among voters. So in some states, you do need a physical photo ID in order to vote. And in those states, a free photo ID may be an option for a voter. That's not something that we have here. So the affidavit is the best way for a voter to vote if they don't have that ID on them. So in your manual, I put in 3 different scenarios that go along with photo ID. And almost all of the things that we're going to see in the precinct fall into one of these 3 categories. The first is that the voter has a valid driver's license or a state ID. Most of our voters are going to have a driver's license or state ID. If it's a Michigan license, that doesn't have to be, it can be expired. That's okay. That still works. And the address doesn't have to match. The easiest way to manage this is to take the photo ID, and then on a driver's license, there's a magnetic strip on the back. We just slide that through our card reader on the poll book laptop, and that pops up the voter's information. So the photo ID in Michigan is really just used to more quickly issue a ballot to a voter. It pops right up when you swipe the card, or on the poll book, there's a way to search for the voter's information too. It's a little bit faster if you use the magnetic strip, although we have had many times when the magnetic card readers don't work or they don't work well, and then you can just revert back to typing it in. It's still pretty quick to search for it that way. So first scenario, by far the vast majority of voters, 90 to 95% of voters are going to have that state-issued driver's license or ID. After that, a voter may have a different form of photo ID. So scenario 2, voter might have a passport, a military ID, a student ID, a tribal ID, or any other state or federally issued photo ID. That includes other states' driver's licenses, and that does include an employment badge. If somebody works for the state of Michigan or another state or the federal government, they can use that ID in order to vote. I have a county ID. It does have my photo on it and my signature. This, because it's issued by the county and not by the state or federal government, cannot be used. So if I went in to vote and I only had my name badge from the county, I'd have to sign the affidavit on the back of the application in order to be issued a ballot. This will not count. So, yes. Expired state or federal ID. If you have an expired driver's license from another state, that is not a valid form of ID. Otherwise, I believe an expired passport does work. And an expired student ID from Michigan should also work. So those are acceptable. It's a little bit different with an out-of-state driver's license, but otherwise, there's no need for it to be current. Okay, so scenario 3, and the last one, is if a voter does not have a valid form of ID or does not have a photo ID. This is something we've already talked about. This is if you fill in the affidavit on the back of the application to vote. So if they come in without an ID, that's not a problem. They still can be issued a ballot. We do keep track of the number of voters who've signed this affidavit. So there's a couple different ways of doing it. Every jurisdiction does this slightly differently. Some jurisdictions have you flag that particular application just by bending a corner or using Post-it notes at the end of the night. But that is something we keep track of just for record's sakes. If a voter has a photo ID but then refuses to show it at the poll book station, that actually is a problem. We cannot issue a ballot to a voter if they have an ID but they're just not showing it to us. So that's something that only comes up rarely, usually with our friendliest, happiest customers. But that is Michigan law. If they have an ID and they're just waving it in our face and saying, I'm not going to show this to you, we can't issue them a ballot. That is Michigan law. If you have an ID, then we can issue you a ballot. If you don't have it, we can still issue you a ballot. You just have to sign the affidavit. If that voter, oh, yes, go for it. That's a good question. So the question was, if you vote by you signing the affidavit instead of showing an ID, your vote still counts the same. There's no flag on your voter record. There's no mark on that. We do count the number of people who use that option, but we don't tie it to a voter. So that's, yes, it works completely the same as if you'd shown an ID. That's a good question. You can record it in the general remarks section, but do not record it in the voters' remarks section. So we want to try to keep it slightly separated from that voter's record. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to kind of walk through the steps of issuing a ballot in the e-poll book. So once you've signed your affidavit or you've shown an ID, then whoever's working at the poll book laptop can issue a ballot to a voter. So in your manual on page, let's see here. So pages 24 and 25, there are a few different pictures that show you step by step how to issue ballots in the poll book. There's also a checklist in the back of the book that allows you can follow to issue the ballots. So the first thing is you'll find that voter either swiping the driver's license or searching in the search bar. You'll hit lock this voter record, and then that brings up this screen. Oops. So on the voter's screen, you'll have a few options. You'll have the option to issue a regular ballot, or you can spoil a ballot, issue an envelope, provisional ballot. But by and large, what we're going to do with every single voter, the first interaction with every voter who's in our poll book, is going to be hit regular ballot. We're just going to issue a regular ballot to that voter. And then that pops up a window, says you're about to issue a regular ballot to, then the voter's name, and then this ballot number will be assigned. This number auto-populates after the first voter. So the first one you put in there, you want to make sure that you enter the correct ballot number, and then you'll be verifying this number compared to the number on the stub of the ballot that you're issuing to the voter. Let's see. Once you have a voter number and a ballot number, you'll put that on the application. So the voter's application to vote has a couple of small boxes on the side where you can enter a voter number and a ballot number. The ballot number comes from the stub on the ballot. The voter number comes from the listing of voters on the right-hand side, and that is the voter's number, the voter number right here. So it's literally the order that they walk into the precinct. Both of those numbers get put onto the application to vote. Okay. Any questions on issuing ballots? Okay. Now that I've gone through the whole process of issuing a ballot, I'm going to tell you a completely different process for issuing a ballot. On the TouchWriter, we have to do this a little bit differently because we have blank ballot stock. There's no stub on this paper, so there's no number on here. So when we issue a ballot to a voter, we need to get their ballot number from something. So what we actually are going to do is we're going to take an original ballot. They're going to walk up to the poll book station. They'll be issued a ballot in that same exact procedure. We will put in their name, we'll issue them a ballot, we'll hand them, we'll set aside a ballot for them. That's the next ballot number. So let's say that they're being issued ballot number 100. It'll say 100 on the stub, and what we're going to do is we're going to tear off the ballot stub and hand the stub to the voter instead of the ballot. And then they're going to take that stub over to the TouchWriter. They'll vote on the TouchWriter as normal. And then when they go to vote at the scan, once their ballot prints, their stub is essentially, it's like their stub is already torn off of their ballot. It's working the same way. So that stub will get handed to the worker at the tabulator station, and then they'll vote their ballot that printed normally. So that leaves a ballot, a blank, unstubbed ballot, back at the poll book station. We're going to take that ballot and put it into the VAT ballot storage envelope. So essentially, we're just taking that ballot for its ballot number, and we're storing it in here just so that we can account for each ballot that's being issued on Election Day. So this will help us make sure that our numbers are on with the ballots that we're issuing. So those steps for issuing a ballot on the TouchWriter are right here on page 26. A voter arrives at the poll book station. They're issued a regular ballot. The number on this ballot, the ballot stub, is then issued to the voter. We'll hand the stub back to the voter to be returned at the tabulator station. And then on that original ballot that we're left with back at the poll book station, we're going to write TW in the top corner, in the top right corner of the ballot. We're going to fold it in half. We're going to place it into this envelope. So this will just be a blank ballot, and then this will be our accounting of how many TouchWriter ballots were issued on Election Day. Any questions on that procedure? Okay. So I'm going to roll right into voting on the TouchWriter. So this is pretty straightforward once we get our access code. So I showed you earlier that blue button. So we're going to hit the blue button in order to issue an access code. So when it's on this screen, it's ready for voters. So we're going to hit the blue button. And then I'll enter our poll worker code, which for this election is going to be the 6-digit election date. And we're going to hit create ballot access code. In order to do this, we have to select our precinct. Most precincts in the county have their own TouchWriter. If that's the case, then your precinct's going to be the only one that's listed on this screen. If there are multiple precincts that are sharing a device, you just have to make sure you hit the correct precinct. Same is true if a voter is in a different split. We have to make sure we're issuing that ballot, the same ballot that was handed to them at the poll book station. So just need to make sure that if it's precinct 2B, that they're getting issued a precinct 2B ballot on the TouchWriter. So we select our precinct on the side. There's a little green check mark that pops up. We hit OK. And then it's going to ask us, do we want to print the access code? And yes, we do. So we'll go ahead and hit print. So this will take it just a second. It's printing a randomly generated 5-digit number. And this is how we can actually get a ballot on this device. So that's the security feature that prevents somebody from just walking up and printing off a bunch of ballots. So at this point, we're going to tear this number off, and we will enter this number for the voter. And again, it's really hard to do backwards. I just don't recommend this. Okay, so you enter the number here and then hit accept and begin voting. So we can have the voter hit the begin voting button. That brings them to their ballot immediately. So at this point, we want to walk away and let the voter vote independently. Now, if somebody needs assistance, they can have assistance, but we need a Democrat and Republican to assist any voter, whether they're using a TouchWriter or a paper ballot. We have a designated Democrat and Republican in each precinct who can assist people who are voting a ballot. So we want to make sure there's some transparency in that process, that we're not just we don't just have one person kind of strong-arming how somebody's voting. But this device is set up to allow somebody to vote. You can use the click wheel and the select button to select your options on the ballot. And if you're using this, it will also play the ballot audio on here. So quick demonstration of that. So it should. Okay, it's a little quiet on here. I can turn this way up, but it gets really loud. You want to be sure to keep the volume on here at about a 10. It goes to 20. I don't know why 20, but 20 is really loud. So as the voter goes through this process, they're going to vote their ballot. And I'm just going to skip ahead. So this is an option for you to view all of your choices on the ballot. This machine won't let you overvote. You can only vote for the number of positions available. Takes you through each office step by step, but you don't have to vote in each office. You can skip any that you don't want to vote in. So once, oh, that's a good question. So for a write-in vote, let's see. So for a write-in vote, it takes you to a screen with a keyboard, and you can just enter a write-in vote that way.
Did you say there's Braille on the key?
There are Braille controls on this device. Yes. So this has Braille just saying select the select button, the help button, or the move wheel. These devices have been in use. We've used them just over the last year or so. So we purchased all of this equipment in 2017. So we've had these in use. August was the largest election that we've had them in use so far, but we did have them used in a couple elections in 2017. And Michigan is among the first states that have had these devices out in the field. There are a couple of other states that have used these in the about year or so before we got them.
What's been the experience with the people who are actually doing the voting, catching on to how to use it right away, or is there a lot of explanation?
That's a really good question. Right, it is. Yeah, that's a really good question. So for the voters' experience, at least the feedback I've gotten, do you have a comment on that? Or, oh, okay. For our experience, what we've been hearing is that voters have taken to it pretty well, and they don't need a lot of explanation. I think from just my own use of the equipment, my own concern is making sure that voters who are using this device understand that they have to tabulate their printed ballot. But the actual using and voting on the equipment seems to be pretty intuitive for most people. Yeah. Yeah. Question? Yes. That's a good question. So this is actually going to go into the green VAT ballot storage envelope. And that way we have we should have one of these for each ballot in here. So there may be reasons why it doesn't match perfectly, but that's where that will go. It's a good question. So once the voter goes through their ballot, they're going to click the print button at the bottom of the screen, and they'll hit yes, print a blank. So this is printing a blank ballot. So they'll hit yes, print my ballot. And then this is going to the printer. And because we're using the 20-inch paper, this is causing an error message. So we just have to hit OK on the printer. And that's something that we can either instruct the voter to do or we can help them with. At this point, there's no voted ballot present. So one election inspector can assist a voter at this point. But as soon as that ballot prints, if they still need assistance, we need a Democrat and Republican to assist with this ballot. So it does print the full double-sided ballot, and then this ballot will get run through the tabulator in order to be counted. This one's going to come up with an error message because I didn't vote anything. So that's what happens if you vote a blank ballot. Yeah. Yes. Mhm. Yes. Yep, that's a great question. So at the poll book station, you would get both the stub and your secrecy sleeve, even though you wouldn't have a ballot inserted in that at that point. Yep, good question. Yeah, any other questions so far? Okay. Sure. Yeah, you want to take spoiled ballots? Okay.
Alrighty.
Should I knight you with this?
Sure,
All
that sounds fun. Oh.
Here you go. Oh, you're taller than I am.
Nope. All right. So just kind of want to continue on with the section covering a couple of, I guess, special circumstances that we'll very likely see in the precinct. Talking about spoiled ballots here that kind of go over the process of spoiling a ballot. One thing I want to mention here is that we do have a little bit of a unique process for November. For this November, that's different than the past 140 years in Michigan elections, and that is the elimination of the straight ticket voting. So I don't know how many of you have heard in the news, this happened in September. Originally, it was a legislative decision. It got held up in the courts from 2016 until September of this year. So basically, the state legislature removed that option from the ballot. They were sued over it. And it remained on the ballot in the presidential election, and now 2 years later, it's being removed. So straight ticket voting basically allows you to fill in one bubble for a particular party, and that would effectively cast a vote for every candidate in that party. Ottawa County heavily used the straight ticket voting option. So it's kind of a unique process that almost 60% of our voters in a general election typically use straight ticket voting. So whatever you personally think of straight ticket voting, all I know as an election administrator is it saves time. So it's saved time because now what we're doing is effectively marking about 18 additional offices on the ballot, right? So if you're a voter of a particular political persuasion and you go in and say, no, I always vote straight Republican or straight Democratic or whatever, that's one mark instead of 20 individual candidates that you're going to have to read and decide whether or not you want to vote for those candidates. So either way we deal with it, it's going to be more time, period. So voters do not have to mark every office on the ballot. There's no obligation that you have as a voter to go down and mark every single office that's to be elected. You could walk in and vote for your cousin who's running for whatever, and that could be the one vote that you cast. Or you could fill in every single bubble. So when we talk about spoiled ballots, I think one of the realities we're going to have to look at is voters who are walking into the precinct. And remember, this is a high turnout election, what I like to call the Christmas and Easter crowd. So, at church, it's always really full at Christmas and Easter. The May election, not quite as busy. So these people are not necessarily as used to the voting process as the people who are constantly in the polls, who are voting in May and voting in August and voting every election. So the reality is we may have more spoiled ballots in November. The other significant factor is lines or wait times at the voting booths. So just want to give you a quick overview of what we've been telling your local clerks and what we've kind of been working on to prevent that. We want to set up more voting booths. We want really as many voting booths as we possibly can. We don't know exactly how the elimination of straight party voting is going to affect our lines. We can only guess. And what we've done, the Bureau of Elections took a sampling and said it's going to take the average voter 5 to 8 additional minutes to mark their ballot. So we actually did a conservative estimate of that. We said let's do 3 minutes per ballot additionally. And then we said not every single voter who voted straight party, not all 60% of those people are going to complete the entire ballot. So let's take 2/3 of that 60%. Say 2/3 of the 60% complete their entire ballot, and it takes them 3 additional minutes. That's 16 more hours per precinct. 16 more hours in the voting booth during the entire day per precinct. So the reality is there's just no way around it taking more time. We've advised that for every 80 to 100 voters in your precinct, you have a voting booth for every 80 to 100. Typically, the law says you have to have one for every 300 voters. But I think that our concern is that's where the holdup is going to be, because if you're sitting there marking a ballot or trying to figure out who you're voting for, that's where the holdup is going to be. So just another reality that we kind of want to make you guys aware of. And for you new folks, congratulations. You're the first crowd that gets to experience. But it's new to all of us. So we'll we'll see how that goes. Yes, sorry. That is absolutely our hope, and we've been on the media. We have social media ads. We have talked to everybody. I've talked to my family. I've talked to my mailman. I've talked to everybody. Please help me out in that. Actually, we have created a little infographic that's on our website that basically is a 3-step thing. Time-saving tips for voters. 1, be educated. Know your ballot. You can go to michigan.gov/vote. You can go to miottawa.org/elections. You can see every candidate that's on your ballot. We have some really cool tools out there for voters now too. Secondly, pick a good time to go vote. The busiest time to vote is 7 a.m. The busiest time statistically to vote is 7 o'clock in the morning. That's when a lot of people are going to work and they're on their way and they want to cast their ballot. Typically, if you vote from 9 a.m. to noon, that's a slower time, or 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Those are known statistically slower times for people to vote. The other thing we want people to do is get an absentee ballot if you can. There's 7 statutory reasons to have an absentee ballot. The most common is you're over 60, if you have a permanent disability, if you expect to be absent from the community on election day during the hours that the polls are open. Those are all options for you to get an absentee ballot. You can fill it out at your kitchen table, and that saves time for you and for other voters who are in line. So that's a very good point. So please feel free to pass on that information, because that is important that we get the word out there. Yeah. So you are also, that's one of the other excuses, reasons for an absentee ballot, is if you are working the election, because typically, just because of the way it works out, you're not always in your precinct, and a lot of you may work in a different jurisdiction than you even live. So you are absolutely entitled to an absentee ballot. I would encourage you guys to do that and get one from your local clerk as soon as you can too. And even if you happen to be in the precinct, you're still entitled to get one. Sometimes election day gets busy. Steve and I always apply for an absentee ballot as well. We never know where we're going to be on election day. Yeah. Monday at 4 p.m. before the election, November 4, Monday, November 4, before the election. On that Monday, you cannot leave the clerk's office with a ballot. You have to vote it there because they don't want you to take it back and then try to mail it in. So Saturday before the election is the date that, sorry, it's November 5, by the way, is Monday. But Saturday, November 3, is the deadline to apply for an absentee ballot and then leave the office with the ballot. Yes. So typically it is a more expensive letter or envelope to mail back. It depends. Sometimes it's 60 cents. Depends on the length of the ballot, how big the envelope is. If you put a stamp on there, the post office is required to deliver it. They'll charge your municipality for any extra overage. But because it's election mail, in fact, quite often without a stamp, it gets delivered. But don't tell the federal government. It's all our money anyway, right? It's taxpayer money. But yeah, so they are required to deliver it with one stamp. Pardon? Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because it's typically not that much over the typical first-class rate. Yes, absolutely. Most all of your local jurisdictions have drop boxes as well, but you can obviously walk in during office hours and turn it in. The ballots are counted on election day. They're not counted before. Yes?
Says it on the website, there is, you put a little blurb, is that something we can copy and paste in social media?
Yeah, it sure is. So, yes, we have it on the, it's actually on the front page of the county's website. Is it today, Steve? I know we were working with it. So it's miottawa.org. And so I think if you search on Facebook or something, it's Ottawa County Clerk Register of Deeds also. You can find it there too. But yeah, we appreciate that for sure. Yeah. So we have about 40 minutes or so left, and I want to get through some of this material as well. So I'll kind of keep going here, but we'll just show you quickly. We have actually quite a bit of information on the front page of the website. We have a great new tool for voters, and you guys can feel free to check this out as well. If you go online at the link below.
This is just miottawa.org/elections. And there's a few things here. So I can. Another microphone up here too. So there are a few things up on the website. Key things that may be helpful for you all is the Find My Polling Place app. You can just click on this link here that will take you to a page hosted by the county's GIS department where you can put in your address, and that will show you where your polling place is. You can also see here on the Find My Elected Officials app, if you click this link, this will take you to a complete listing of all of your elected officials. So from governor down to school board. And I'll show you who is currently in office.
Just by entering your address. I'm a total nerd, but I'm really proud of that because there's really not very many places at all, certainly not anywhere in Ottawa County that you could go to find all of that information in one central location before. So again, that's just another tool for voter education that we want to make people aware of. Oh, okay. That's good. So it's pretty slick.
On here you can get directions, you can view a copy of your ballot, you can see where your polling place is, just highlighted in blue right there. Yes, question.
Because I work poll, people ask me, how do I find out where I'm registered? I don't know what to tell them.
So this link will give that information. If they know they are a registered voter, they can literally just enter that right from the website there. The easiest, though, is to tell them to go to michigan.gov/vote. Michigan.gov/vote. It'll ask you for a couple of personal details, your last name, date of birth, and it will pull up your registration. If you're a registered voter, you will find it there because that connects to our voter database statewide. And there's a lot of good information on that site as well, but yeah, that's a great question. Yes, ma'am. October 9. So it's 30 days prior to the election date currently. And that was October 9. That's a good question. So yeah, going over a couple of those scenarios as well, you may have a voter who does not appear on the poll list. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, they may not have registered in time for the deadline, and it might not have populated on the poll list. Two, they may be in the incorrect precinct. So when you walk in, it's all by precinct, right? And so your electronic poll book has that data only for your precinct. One of the nice features of the electronic poll book is that you do have another tab on there that will actually allow you to search the entire jurisdiction. So for example, if you live in the city of Holland and you're voting in a particular precinct, the voter doesn't come up, you can search the entire city for that voter's name and at least tell them where they need to go. It'll give the address of their polling location. But it only encompasses that jurisdiction. So if they're not showing up on either place, I would call the local clerk. Make sure that you call your clerk for anyone who doesn't appear on your list of voters. That's always a good rule of thumb. So kind of continuing on here with our spoiled ballot process. So basically, a voter who spoils a ballot, there will be a couple of error messages that come up on this machine. So some of the common errors are, especially in a big election with a lot of candidates on the ballot, if you vote for more than the required number of candidates. So a lot of our judicial races and all of our state boards, State Board of Education, Wayne State University Board of Governors, U of M Regents, all those people that everyone knows so much about. So those are a vote for 2. So you want to be careful as a voter not to choose more than that. So that's a common issue of a spoiled ballot. And the equipment is nice because it is pretty communicative with the voter. So this whole touchscreen display will come up with the error message. It'll tell them the office that they overvoted in, for example. So one of the jobs of the person who is at kind of station 3, which is that station where you're closest to the tabulator, you've just removed their ballot number stub, you took their application to vote. If there's a problem, it's kind of the job of that person to communicate with the voter, remembering that we have to remain 10 feet away from the tabulator unless we're asked by the voter to assist them. And when we are asked, it's always 2 people that approach the tabulator. A Republican and a Democrat have to do that. So with a spoiled ballot, it's kind of an easy process right here on the screen. So the voter actually removes the ballot, brings it over to typically the help desk. Your chairperson can help out with this process. We have the voter right spoiled on the top of the ballot. Though that ballot is also initialed by a Republican and a Democratic precinct worker. And then it goes into this bag, and this envelope, the spoil ballot envelope. So once we put it in there, we're also taking the voter's application to vote that they just handed over at station 3. We cross that old ballot number out, and they actually get back. They can go back to the front of the line, but they go back to the e-poll book station where they are issued a new ballot. We do have a good checklist for that. I think it's checklist 7, which is in the back of the book that kind of goes detail by detail what it is we have to do. But essentially, as we spoil the ballot, the electronic poll book does quite a bit of the work for us. We do not have to put anything additionally in the remarks section, because that's automatically a field that the EPB updates. But we do want to write their new ballot number on the application to vote, give that back to the voter. They take their ballot back into the voting booth, vote the ballot, follow the same procedure, come back to the last station, their stub gets removed, their application gets taken, and then they can vote again. So how many times can a voter spoil a ballot? Does anybody know the rule? Right. It'd be a long process sometimes, but And especially with a lot on the ballot, it is challenging. And that kind of, oh, sorry. I believe so. I think that we will see probably a bit higher because of that removal of straight ticket. When you think about it, so straight ticket only covers the partisan races, and then we have judges and ballot proposals. But typically 60% of our voters, that's about 80,000 voters, 75, 80,000 voters, would just go and mark that one bubble and then go, complete the rest of their ballot. So, right, exactly. So it's a lot more there to take a look at. Sorry, there is not. There is no limit. So that can be challenging. And that actually brings us to page 31, where we want to talk about assisting voters in the precinct. There's a couple of ways that we can assist voters in the precinct. And what I would say, if you get a situation where someone is spoiling their ballot multiple times, you can offer assistance. It just has to be given by a Republican and a Democratic precinct worker. So the state law governs this, and it talks about major political parties have to be represented in the precinct. And those parties are considered the parties that receive the greatest number of votes for the office of president in the state of Michigan. So in our case, it's always the Republican and Democratic parties, has been for a little while now. So you can offer to assist a voter in that way, as long as there are two of you there present. A voter can also request that you assist them in that way. And that is completely fine. We do ask that get put in the general remarks section of the poll book, just to note who gave the assistance and what time it was, just so that there's a record of that as well for our Board of Canvassers. The other way that voter can request assistance, they can actually request somebody else assist them. They can bring someone into the precinct with them to assist them. And this is a federal requirement. They're protected under federal law and able to do this. There are a couple of stipulations to that. One is that person that they bring in cannot be a member of their union. They cannot be their employer. And the other is that the voter is actually requesting the assistance because of a disability or inability to read or write. And that's the way that's worded in the federal law. But that does cover, for example, someone who is on the voter rolls but may not speak English or read English well. They can bring someone in to assist them in that way. The only stipulation there is we actually are required to ask them the questions. So if I came in and I brought a friend with me and I said, hey, here's my buddy, he's going to help me vote. Your job is to then ask me, well, sir, are you requiring this assistance based off of of a disability or inability to read or write? And that's just a yes or no question. All I have to say is yes to that. You don't have to ask me, what's your disability? Or, how many fingers am I holding up? You don't have to go through anything else. That's just a yes or no question. The second question that we ask is for the person who's there doing the assisting. Are you this person's employer? Are you a member of a union representing this person? So then that harkens back to the good old days of Tammany Hall, where unions did a lot of things they shouldn't have done. Yeah, Luann. Yeah, it is acceptable to put the voter's name. I do not believe it's required to put their name, but there's not an issue with that, with putting the name. So quick note on your remarks page, especially for all of you guys who are new. So the remarks, they get entered into the electronic poll book, and they are printed out at the end of the night. They're put in the physical poll book, and they're brought to the county clerk's office. And they serve kind of as a record of what happened in the precinct for the Board of County Canvassers. So our county canvassers is a 4-member board. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. They're appointed independently, and they actually come to our office the day after the election, and they begin an audit of the entire election process. So their job is to literally physically open every poll book, look at the number of voters who voted, make sure that matches the number of ballots that were cast, make sure that you guys signed all of the places where you're supposed to sign. It's a pretty detailed audit, and one of the things they use is the remarks section. So for example, if something doesn't balance or if there's something confusing in the data there, they can go to the remarks section and see what happens. So that they're helpful things to include there for the Board of Canvassers. Some of the things that you don't need to include would be the pizza wasn't very good, things like that. There's all kinds of interesting stories that end up in the remarks section, which we don't really mind reading, but we don't need to. There was a story in, I don't know, August or November of last cycle. I think it was the presidential cycle, where a guy ran into a screen door and cut his leg badly, and EMS was called, and there was a lot of, it's kind of gory, but it's fine, but you don't need to put that in the remarks. So that's who reads it, basically. So it's not necessarily your local clerk who's seeing those remarks section. It's actually that Board of Canvassers, our audit team that is there following the election. Are there any questions on assisting voters? Oh, yes, ma'am. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's correct. So that's a good point, actually, and that's something that we want to cover as well in terms of maintaining the order in the polling place. Normally, it's not okay, and you cannot talk in between voting booths, right? People can't be talking while they're in the voting booth. It's much more common than what you would realize, but in the case of a voter being assisted, certainly there has to be that communication, even if you're doing it with another worker as well. But you definitely want to keep the volume at least to a level where you're not interfering with other voters. The other thing that we have seen done in the past, and if you've got somebody who's hard of hearing, they maybe bring their child in to help them vote, that's acceptable. Sometimes it's an option to find a quieter space within the precinct where you can literally say, hey, you know what, there's this table over here, we'll give you guys a corner and you can go about your business. So that's acceptable for sure. The main point is just kind of using common sense and making sure that voters aren't disrupted during the process. And that's the other thing that we have to do, is make sure that cell phone usage within the voting area is not permitted. And it becomes increasingly hard to police something like that, especially within the voting booth. People in this age of technology have a lot of need to use those devices, and if you're in the voting booth and you want to look something up, or maybe you had a list written down on your notes section of your phone or something like that. And again, I would say we just have to use our common sense with that. Your job is not to go around peeking around voters' shoulders, seeing if they have a cell phone out. It's in the more obvious scenarios where you've got somebody in line and they're on the phone, that's not allowed. Or if you've got somebody, talking loudly on the phone, that's not allowed. If they're taking photographs, that's definitely not allowed. So there are certain points where we do have to kind of step in and enforce those rules, but that's a good question. All right, so just kind of going down the list of some of the special circumstances. Steve talked a little bit about poll watchers and challengers as well. We will have poll watchers and poll challengers in this election for sure. There are a couple of things to note about them. As Steve was saying earlier, poll watchers really could be anybody. You or I or anybody else can walk into a precinct and we can watch the polls. Even after the election closes at 8 p.m. and you're there wrapping up and signing your materials. It's a public place and a poll watcher can be there. The real difference too is that a challenger a challenger has to be appointed either by a political party or by an organization specifically that is not a candidate. So a candidate's committee or a candidate cannot appoint a poll challenger. It has to be the political parties or like a special interest group. And those people have to display credentials. They have to do that to your chairperson in the precinct. They have to report to the chairperson. They are given access to literally be with you behind the e-poll book station. You can give them a chair if you feel nice and have the space. But they're able to see those materials. They cannot touch any materials in the polling place. And I do bring this up because one of our frustrations over the years has been the ability that the poll challengers have to use an electronic device. So again, the political parties are typically the people who are driving poll challenging, and they have, a list of 10,000 names that they want to get, these people need to vote on election day. And so they have these very nice tools that they can use, apps on phones or tablet, that as I'm a challenger, I can literally check off the names from behind the poll book as somebody comes in. And then that automatically goes to the party headquarters, and they can see all the people that they need to call and all the people they don't need to worry about. So that is allowed. Our Secretary of State has made a determination that those electronic devices are allowed. So it could be an app on someone's cell phone. They cannot use their cell phone. They can't talk on the cell phone while they're standing there. They cannot take a photograph or video while they're standing there. And it is a little more challenging for you guys because it puts you in the position of having to kind of monitor that, and that's unfortunate. But don't be afraid to use a little muscle, and we have your back on that and making sure that they're using it only for the purpose of getting that data. One nice thing about Ottawa County is that we do have a pretty good relationship with both of our county party organizations. Steve and I will be conducting training for poll challengers at the party level. So that's where we go in with the political parties and just kind of tell them, hey, here's the rules from the election law perspective, what you need to follow. And we try to be accommodating to them because this is a public process, but also the foremost goal is making sure that our voters are taken care of. So, sorry, at the top of the page there on page 32, campaigning and exit polling. So campaigning, oh, go ahead. Yeah, no problem.
Poll challengers, do they have the right to see? Do they have the right to request?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so the question was, they have the right to see stuff. Do they have the right to request that you do stuff and produce stuff for them? And the answer is, we want to try to accommodate, but it's within reason. So yes, if I'm a challenger and I ask you, hey, can you just scroll up a little bit through this list and make sure that I've got every name, that's something that you probably should try to accommodate as long as there's no voters in line, as long as you have the time to do that. If there's a line of voters, it's literally, their tough luck until you have a quiet time where you can fulfill that request, if that makes any sense. Yes, ma'am. So an organized interest group could be really anything. Could be Save the Whales, Save the Trees. One example of that is the NAACP. They have actually formed so the political parties do not have to request permission, any recognized political party, but the interest group parties do. So an interest group does have to actually send us a letter and request, hey, we want to have challengers at this election. So one of those organizations is the NAACP. They have requested to have challengers at polling places in Allegan County. We have not gotten any such requests from them before the deadline. So, but that's just an example. Could really be anything, though. We don't have any requirements of what that interest group would be. They're good questions. Campaigning, another thing that people love to do on election day, because we just haven't had enough of it. the rest of the year, right? Frequently, what you'll see are people or maybe signs outside of polling locations. This upsets a lot of voters, and sometimes you'll hear about it as they walk in. They might tell you, well, hey, there's a sign for so-and-so outside, and how is that allowed? So the answer to that is it is allowed by law if it's 100 feet away from any exit or entrance to the polling place. So it does have to be 100 feet away outside of the building. Otherwise, you can collect petition signatures, you can sell Girl Scout cookies, you can wave signs for candidates, you can do whatever you want, because election day, that polling location is public property. So even if it's on the grounds of a church and you're collecting petition signatures for something that church does not agree with, the day of the election, that location becomes public property, and so people are allowed 100 feet away.
100 feet from the entrance to the building.
Yep, any entrance to the building.
This is going to be minutia, but I noticed in one of the things about candidates, lots of bumper stickers.
Yeah.
What do you do with federally mandated handicap parking and
Yeah.
somebody who's got campaign stuff?
Right, and that happens a lot. So somebody's campaign material on their car is acceptable as long as it's there during the time that they are voting. If ironically it takes them 6 hours to vote, you might want to question that. So, and that is and we've had that before, where someone will conveniently park their car close to the building and then leave. And we have the authority to get rid of that vehicle if it's not there simply for a voter who is in voting during a normal circumstance. So, yeah, that's a great question. Exit polling is another thing that's a little less common. Exit pollsters will be at a few of our locations. I think they're going to be in Jamestown and Park Township, possibly. But only specific precincts. And so those people are basically from a media organization or a polling firm, and their only job is to be there and ask voters as they leave, if they want to answer, how did you vote? So an exit pollster they're a little more privileged, and they can be 20 feet away from the doorway. They cannot be inside the doorway if it's raining. We get a lot of that too sometimes from exit pollsters that want to come inside. Any questions on that? All right. So I think we've got Steve reminded me we're till 3:30 here, so I thought we were till 3. So we do have a little bit of time to cover some of some of the most critical material. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes, great question, and I apologize that I didn't bring that up earlier during the campaigning. So, very common for people to wear the campaign apparel or represent a political party or candidate, and in the precinct that is not allowed. They have to be asked to remove that material or to cover it up. That's a great question. One thing that we want to make you aware of, there was a Supreme Court case that happened that was decided earlier this year, I believe, in June, over this issue. And it was a state of Minnesota law, which was a little more broad. The person that the case actually surrounded was wearing a "Don't Tread on Me" hat or shirt or something. So in a case where it doesn't particularly represent a candidate or a political party, we don't really have the authorization under our law to ask a voter to remove it. Pardon me? It does, but it does not represent a candidate or a political party. So that is the ruling. That's been our law all along. But the Supreme Court kind of clarified that for the state of Minnesota, and that basically if it's not a candidate directly affiliated with the election or a political party directly affiliated with the election, we really should probably shy away from asking them to remove something, unless if they're being a disruptive person, that kind of falls under a different category. Yes, sir. Yeah. Great question. Yeah. So that also falls under that rule. So if you are promoting anything on the ballot, you can't do that in the polling place. So yeah, great point, because we have a number of proposals obviously on the ballot as well. School districts sometimes will do that, right? You'll have buttons that people wear to support school millage or something. Those things are also considered campaigning at the precinct. That's a great question.
What if the T-shirt is like against a candidate nastily? I mean, there's a lot of that out there. So if you're against
Right.
then is that the same thing?
Are you saying that there's like people who don't like other people in the political process now? Division or something? Yeah, right. Yeah, anything that represents or promotes or mentions any candidate or issue on the ballot is not allowed. That's a good point. Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah, so the famed "Make America Great" hat again is not considered a representative of a political party or a candidate, believe it or not. What if you just want to make America great again? I mean, what if you're just a normal, everyday person that wants to make America great? So that's frustrating. I agree with you. I didn't make these rules up. But that's kind of where the law falls. And, it fortunately, in one sense, protected Michigan's laws from the decision of the Supreme Court, which basically ruled in the Minnesota case more broadly, because in Minnesota it was much more open to interpretation. And so we have not had that in the past, although I think we've been a little more broad in our execution of that law. Now we're kind of having to take a step back. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so before we move on to the section on closing the polls, we're going to go through a few scenarios. So,
This is weird.
thank you. So now the camera will track my every movement. On page 33 of your manual, I'm going to have you all turn to that. And I'm just going to have you kind of work on a couple of different scenarios. So for, let's do it, I guess, this half of the room. Let's see. For this half of the room, I'm going to give you scenario number 1 on page 33. For this half of the room, I'm going to give you scenario number 6 on page 33. So for the next probably about 5 minutes or so, you can take a look at those scenarios just with the people sitting right around you. Take a few minutes to talk those over and come up with an answer, and then I'll ask for a couple of volunteers to give what they came up with. So go ahead and look those over, and we'll check back with you in a few minutes. All right, it seems like conversation's starting to die down just a little bit, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So I think the conversations started to die down just a little bit, so I think we'll bring everybody back. So we're going to look at the first scenario here. So I gave that to this side of the room. A voter walks up to the e-poll book without a driver's license. She does happen to be carrying a copy of her latest utility bill, a concealed pistol license, and a current driver's license from Indiana. Can this voter be issued a ballot? Does somebody have an answer? Yes. Okay. So yes. So this voter can be issued a ballot, and
Also, she does not have a driver's license.
yes.
That's a real problem.
Yeah. It'd be hard to get a driver's license in Indiana, though. Oh, that's a really good question. So the question was, this is somebody who is a CPL holder. Can they bring a gun into the polling place? Those rules actually follow the rules of the place where someone's voting. So if it's a public building, township hall, city hall, they can conceal carry. If it's a church, which is the case for many of our precincts, then they can't. So the rules follow the location, essentially. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, they have, in precincts in the past, you guys have had people want to vote with their concealed pistol license. Voters have thought that they could. This is, the reason why that's in the question actually is partially because of that. There are states where a concealed pistol license is a valid form of photo ID for the purposes of receiving a ballot. That's not true in Michigan. Michigan's law is that your photo ID has to be a state or federal ID, and a CPL is issued by the county. So it's not a valid governmental entity. So that's the reason. People may very well be confused on that point, and it is okay to say that that's true in other states, but not in Michigan. Very good point. One other thing on here, if this person had a driver's license that was expired, what would they do in that case? Like if they had an expired Indiana driver's license, what would happen? Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. So in that instance, you just sign the affidavit on the back of the application to vote, and the voter would be issued a ballot. Okay, so then we ask this side of the room for number 6. A voter is unsure of where to go vote. She knows that she is registered to vote in your jurisdiction, but is unsure about her precinct. What is the best way to help her find her correct polling location? What did you guys come up with? Page 42. I have to check my own book. All right, page 42. Yes, that's exactly right. So page 42, this is something that we're actually going to go over with our chairs. So I'll pull that up on the screen here. If someone is not on your poll list, the first thing that you can check is the other tab in the e-poll book. And part of the reason why I wanted to ask that question too was because of something that we talked about as a group with our website, miottawa.org/elections. You can put in your information to find your polling place, or michigan.gov/vote, which will show you your registration status and also pull up a map to your polling place there as well. That's something that if the chair has a smartphone, they can pull up on their phone, or that's something that you can instruct the voter to help look at. But in our precinct, we have some really great material to help a voter. The first thing is our poll list. If they're on the poll list, then we know they're in the right spot. If they're on the other tab, then we'll find their precinct and can tell them where to go vote within the jurisdiction. If they're not listed on that other tab, then we can call the clerk. And in that case, the clerk can look up the voter's information as well. So that's something the chair would be tasked with doing. They'd be responsible for calling the clerk in that instance if they're not on that other tab. So yeah, very good. That's good. Any other questions on the scenarios?
Can we ask about any of the others?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was wondering about number 10.
Yeah.
Somebody who's out by the door ready to lock it right at 8 or something. How do you, it's not pavement paper, where
Right.
let you walk in.
Right, exactly. So for number 10, it says voters are still lined up waiting to cast a ballot. How do you determine who is in line in time to cast a ballot? The easiest way to do this, and what I've heard of a lot of jurisdictions doing this, is actually just going to the line and handing out applications to vote to each individual voter. So that way you know if they've been handed an application, they were in line at 8 o'clock. So that is anybody in line must be allowed to vote in that election if they're in line by 8 o'clock. So that's a good question. That's something that we will go over with the precinct chairs as well. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to page 34 after the polls close. So closing the polls, we want to make sure that everyone who is in line at 8 o'clock is issued a ballot, just as we went over. And once everybody has gone through the line, then we have there's a large number of things that we have to do at the end of the night to close out the polls. So there's some important steps that we have to follow. The first thing is we have to make sure that everybody has cast a ballot. So if everybody in line, the line is gone, we have to make sure that nobody's still in line, that nobody needs to be issued a ballot, and that nobody is still voting in the voting booths. We have had instances where voters have still been voting, and the poll workers were really eager to just shut the machine down. So we don't want to do that. What we want to do instead, we just check for. It's always a good idea just to check for feet under the voting booths. So make sure that everybody has cast a ballot. There's nothing left to be run through the tabulator. Then once everybody has left the precinct, all of the ballots have been cast. On the tabulator screen, we'll see our total number of ballots cast here. So that'll be on the bottom of the screen. And that's going to be the first of three things that we have to compare. So we're going to compare the total number of ballots cast. We're going to compare the number of voters on our poll book and the number of applications to vote. So all of those numbers must agree. If those are off for whatever reason, that has to be explained. And if it can't be easily explained, then that's something that will go back to the county. The county board of canvassers is responsible for certifying election results. It's a 4-member board, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and precincts that don't balance come back after the election and get retabulated. So it's not a recount, but it is a retabulation to make sure that everything is balanced the way it should. There are a few instances in which this might not be perfectly aligned, and the main one would be the best example I can think of is if a voter walks into a polling place, they're issued a ballot, and they are just so disgusted by the choices on the ballot, they just walk out and they leave their ballot at their poll booth. That's happened occasionally. I don't know why when there's such excellent choices on every ballot. But there are, if that happens, that ballot is marked as rejected. So that will be marked as rejected in the poll book. So then your poll book will balance. You won't have any issue in your poll book. But what you will have is, let's say you have 1,000 voters on here, you'll have 1,001 voters on your voter list because that's one fewer ballots that went into the machine than voters. So there are some valid reasons why those numbers might not be perfect, but they need to be explained. In the past, notably with our old election equipment, we had our equipment jam. And when that equipment would jam, it was unclear whether that ballot was counted or not. So occasionally, we'd have precinct workers take a jammed ballot and run it through again, and that would count the ballot a second time. Or they wouldn't do that, and it wouldn't have recorded a vote for that voter. So in those instances, those are times when we would retabulate the precinct with the canvassers, and that would balance, that would solve the problem, just because of those individual ballots. So that is something we want to be aware of. We want to make sure that all of those match. So the number of voters in your list of voters should be the same as your applications to vote, and that should be roughly the same. It should be exactly the same as your ballots cast unless there's a reason for the difference. Yes?
What's the reasoning that if somebody left it there?
Oh, that's a good question. So the reason why would you not spoil a ballot if it was just left in a voting booth? So Michigan election law requires that any exposed ballot, so a ballot that's just left on the floor, left in a voting booth, not taken by the voter to the tabulator, that has to be rejected. It can't be counted. And the reason why it's rejected and not spoiled is they're very similar. They work in similar ways in the poll book. But essentially, a spoiled ballot is a ballot that's being replaced. A rejected ballot indicates that ballot's not being replaced and that voter didn't cast a vote. So that's the reason for that difference. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I have all of this information in a couple different ways in the manual. On page 34, it's listed out step by step. On page 35, you can see pictures of all of these steps. So I'm going to walk through pages 35 through 37 using the images to kind of guide what I'm doing. So let's say that we are at 8 o'clock. It's time to close the polls. I'm going to close the polls on our tabulator. So all the ballots have been run through, and we're ready to close the polls. I'm going to hit the blue button on the back of the tabulator. This is the same sort of thing that we did on the touch writer when we were issuing an access code. Hit a blue button on the back, and that kind of gives you these administrative menus. So once you hit the blue button, it brings you to the Close Polls menu. You hit the Close Polls button, and I'm closing the polls early for this election, so I'm saying yes, close the polls. And then you're going to enter your Close Polls code. So for opening the polls and for issuing ballots on the touch writer, that code was 110618. That's the 6-digit election date. For closing the polls, because we want to be sure that we're not doing this, by accident, we close the polls with the same code but reversed. So it's 816011 is the close polls code. So we're going to enter our close polls code in here. And then what this is going to do is it's going to print a copy of the totals tape. Yes. Yes, that's an important part. So before you do this, you want to be sure to unroll your totals tape. So your zero tape that printed in the morning, you're just going to pop that open and pull that out past the writing on it, past the zero tape, and then close that door. And then you'll print your first copy of the results tape. So this is our first copy of the results tape for this election. This is going to be much, much longer. There's a lot on this ballot. But your first results tape will print. That will be connected to your zero tape. And then the next thing that your tabulator is going to do is it's going to send the election results. So this is sending over a cellular connection to our office. And this is a really amazing feature of this system. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a great question and something that we've worked a lot on recently, of course, because so the question was, is this process secure? And there is a lot of background security that goes into the system, and that's something that's been on our mind a lot, especially over the last about year and a half when this has really been a major issue. So for our system, the cellular modeming capability of this is something that has been discussed in the media as being insecure, and there are some systems where it could be better. Our system, though, it kind of meets all of the standards of cybersecurity. Our system has a modem installed in each tabulator, but it's turned off until the polls are closed. And it's only sending a transmission. It's not receiving anything. So it's only sending information in one direction, and it's sending that information through a secured port on the county system. So it's specifically tied to essentially a phone number that it's dialing is at the county that's been predetermined by our office. So all of this is all very internal. It's running on the cellular lines. It's not actually it's not being broadcast in any way. It's going to a very specific spot. It's turned on for that purpose, and then it's turned off immediately. So the modem system, cybersecurity and election security is something that I'm very interested in, want to make sure that we're doing as good of a job as possible on. So that's something I'm very comfortable with our system. But also, in the case of a problem with that cellular modeming, we have the election results both on the V drive, on the USB stick, and we have the paper ballots. So we have quite a bit of backup that we use in order to make sure that those results are accurate. So that's definitely a good question, something I think we may get questions about from voters as well. So if this is all working according to plan, you close the polls, print your totals tape, and then automatically this machine will send those results. And what you should see is this green check mark. So data sent to that number, and you'll hit OK, and that so that means that your results sent. Now on this machine, I have the modem unplugged, so this is not sending. This isn't working. So what this one's saying is modem not initialized. If you get an error message like this on election day, there's a couple things you can do, and it won't affect the machine at all. You can always hit retry, and if you're in a place with poor cell reception, you can actually literally just pick this up and move it to a different location. If you have a Verizon cell phone, this is running on a Verizon 3G network. So you can literally just pick it up and say, you just have to say, "Can you hear me now?" a few times, and it should work. So if it's a cellular reception issue, you can move this and hit retry. If it's not a cell reception issue, you can just power the machine down, power it back on, and see if that fixes the problem. If that doesn't fix the problem, that's an issue where you may want to call your clerk's office. You can also call me directly. And you'll have access to my cell phone number on election day. It's also on the back of the manual as well. So those numbers are all things that I'm asking our clerks to give me a call if there's any issues with modeming on election day. Shouldn't have an issue. In August, we did have a few precincts where we had to turn the machines off and turn them back on. We're fairly confident that we've solved that issue in testing. There was a problem with how we were installing the modem. And that only affected about 5 or 10 precincts. So we're expecting for this election that should work just fine. Of course, we have some backup plans just in case it doesn't. So if you get the green check mark, your results have sent to the county, and then you hit the OK button. As soon as you hit the OK button, 2 more copies of your totals tapes print. So you have 3 copies of your totals at the end of the night. And you're going to be signing this big, long strip of paper 4 times. Once under the 0 report, and then 3 times, once under each of the results reports. Those results reports then get separated and put into different envelopes. One of those goes to the county in the county clerk envelope. One goes to the Board of Canvassers in the Board of Canvassers envelope. And one goes to the local clerks in the local clerk envelope. So, yes, question. Oh, no, that's correct. So on here, you will have a small section that says transmission report. It's not a totals report. You just don't have to sign it. If in doubt, sign it. Yeah. It's never going to hurt you to sign more things. We do need to have everybody sign off on the totals tapes and on the poll book. If you miss a signature, we do call you in after the election to correct that. So it's something you want to make sure you're signing everywhere you need to. We hopefully will not have to call anyone at midnight, except for the clerks. The clerks they're on the hook until we see them. But for you guys, it should be okay, at least until after the election. Once you get your 3 totals tapes, you'll see this screen. So it says print tally, print ballot count, print write-in report, print transmission report, and clear ballots and counters. If for some reason you need to print another tally tape, you can print that from here. So for instance, if you have, let's say you have a member of the media who wants a special report printed, you can print them an extra copy of the tallies tape. That's totally fine. If you're If your clerk, for whatever reason, needs a fourth copy printed, that's fine. You can print an extra copy. The other thing that this says on here, number 10, if there are any valid write-in candidates, you'll print the write-in report. For this election in November, there will be valid candidates. There will be valid write-in candidates. Unfortunately, we don't know who they are yet. That list is compiled by the state. We also have a few, let's see, we have about another week or so, another week and a half, where candidates can file as write-ins. So we may have some local write-ins that file before that time. We almost certainly will have some valid statewide candidates, people running for governor, whatever the case may be. So there will be that list of valid write-in candidates, and we'll make sure that your clerks get you that information. So that will be on the write-in report. So every precinct will print the write-in report. It's just that middle button there. And when you do, that write-in report will go into the county clerk envelope. And I added a label here on the checklist on this envelope for making sure that that goes into this envelope. You will need to use that write-in report, though, before you actually put that into the envelope and seal it up. You'll use that write-in report to write down all of the variations of valid write-in candidates. Now, it is fairly likely that we'll have valid candidates, and we have to check this report, but no one will actually vote for them. People write all sorts of things on the write-in portion of their ballot. Sometimes it's their name, sometimes it's Mickey Mouse, sometimes it's any number of things. I've actually seen a voted ballot that was completely voted, but every single write-in box was filled in and they were all blank. So I don't know how it was worth that person's time to do that. It would have taken some time. It was fairly well done, but it was not effective. So those will all print on that write-in report. Everyone who fills in the box next to the write-in line, that's telling the machine to snap a picture of what the person actually wrote there, and that will populate on the write-in report. We then use that write-in report in our poll book. This is the write-in statement of votes. If we have any valid write-in candidates, we'll write down their name and any variation of their name on here. And then we use that the report that prints on the receipt tape. We use that to tally up each instance of those votes. Both of those things then go to our board of canvassers, and they verify that they are the ones who are responsible for making sure that if William is running as a write-in, that if somebody votes for Bill, that is counted. So they make that determination if that should count or not. If you just use the first initial, is that good enough? It's up to them to make that determination. So both of those things will go into the poll book and into the county clerk envelope. Also on the write-in report, this is a triplicate form. So there's 2 copies. The white copy goes to local clerk. The pink copy goes to the board of canvassers, and then the part that's left behind here, the manila page, that gets included with, that stays with the poll book and comes to us here at the county. Once you have your write-in report and all reports that you need, you can hit the red button on the back and just power the device down. Once you do this, once the device is completely shut down, you can break the seal on the door. So you can break this seal. You're going to remove that black V drive and place that into the blue nylon bag. So that will go into here on election day, and that will be sealed up by a Democrat and Republican election inspector. And that then comes back to us here at the county. So we get those modemed results in, but then we also follow up by replacing the modemed results with the physical USB stick results. The touch writer works much the same way. You hit the poll worker button on the back, and then you'll hit menu on the top of this page, and that takes you to the main menu where you can close the polls. The close polls code is the same as on the scan. It's the backwards election date. And there's nothing that we need to keep off of the touch writer. So once we're done with it, we can just close the polls and power it down. Nothing we have to sign on the touch writer, just on the scan. For the write-in votes, we kind of went over this already, but this is a picture of what the write-in tape looks like. So as you can see, this box has to be filled in with something in order to tell the machine to print that image. And it orders it by contest. So this should be extremely helpful on election night if somebody is voting. They go through and vote their whole ballot for Donald Duck in every office on the ballot. Somebody might actually do that. It's going to organize it by office. So if we're looking for valid write-in candidates in only the governor's office or only the attorney general office, in those that will be separated for our precinct. So we know that we don't have to waste our time sifting through ballots or looking at through every other contest to see if there's valid votes. This will bring them up automatically. And then this is a copy of the write-in statement of votes, just a sample of what that looks like. So I just have a few minutes to go over sealing containers, so I'm just going to go over this briefly. The first thing that I want to go over is this green certificate. The ballot container certificate is filled out with a seal number, and those seals typically look like this. So we usually have blue plastic seals that are in the precinct on election day. Some of our jurisdictions also use like a flat metal seal if you have the older style metal cans. And there's a couple of different ways that we can seal the containers. I have pictures of that in the manual to kind of demonstrate. Before we seal any of the containers, though, we have to fill out the certificate. So we've put this seal number on the certificate that gets signed by a Democrat and a Republican. And I have a copy of this here. So we completely fill out our certificate. It gets signed by a Democrat and Republican. The seal number is recorded. And then we place this certificate into our plastic sleeve. So we do that to make sure that this hasn't been tampered with at all, that that number hasn't been altered. So once that's signed, we place that in here. Then we affix this to our ballot container. And then we can seal it up with our blue plastic seal or the flat metal seal. So on the next page, we have on page 39, this shows kind of a close-up of what this looks like. On our canvas containers, most of our jurisdictions, maybe about half of our jurisdictions, use a canvas bag. And you can see where there's an eyelet next to the zipper. And it's extremely important to zip tie the seal so that nobody can alter this bag. So on the screen here, you can see that's where those are put together, and that's what the blue plastic seal is going through. And we are not sealing it here. That leaves a little bit of room that those zippers could be opened, and it's not much room, but it might be enough to put another ballot in that container, or potentially take one out. So that's something that we want to make sure that's sealed up nice and tight. And that's just right here on the canvas bag, and we want to make sure not to seal here. We don't want to seal the eyes on the pulls. We want to seal the eyelet that's between the zippers. If you have a metal container, it looks like this. And there's two pieces to this. There's this black horseshoe and a flat metal seal that goes between the two. If you use just the flat metal seal, that doesn't cinch up at all. The blue seals do. If you have plenty of these, you can use these on the metal container and just cinch it up tight. And then that keeps this metal lid from opening like that. When you have just the metal seal, because it doesn't pull, that leaves probably about 4 or 5 inch gap that you can use to actually just open that up and grab stuff out of the container, which is not what we want to do. We want to make sure that's sealed up so that it's tamper evident. We want to know if somebody's been into the ballots at all. When you use the horseshoe, this black metal horseshoe, that prevents that metal seal. That just keeps that lid nice and tight. But like I said, you can also use the blue plastic seals on that as well. on your envelopes are going to be sealed slightly differently. So your envelopes have, on the back here, we're just going to seal up everything with a paper seal. So this is, it's called a red paper seal. It used to be more red than this. This is a little bit more of like an Ohio State seal, which I wouldn't tell the Department of State. But we put this on here. This is again signed by our designated Democrat and Republican. And that's just over the lip of the envelope here. Again, so this is tamper evident. This sticker is not going to prevent anyone from opening this envelope, but it will rip if somebody tries to open it. So I do also want to go over a few signature requirements. So there's a lot of places to sign, particularly if you're the designated Democrat or Republican signer in your precinct. You have to sign all of these certificates, and then there's a couple of places you have to sign on the poll book itself. So you sign the front of it, taking the oath of office. The back page of the poll book has where you can record all of the seal and serial numbers. So all of those are recorded here. The chair is responsible for filling out the top portion of this page. Section 2 is the seal number verification. So the Democrat and Republican who signed the certificates, the same people who signed those certificates are going to sign here. And then everyone who is present at the close of polls signs at the bottom here. Now, if you're working in the morning and you're not there when the polls close, you don't have to sign this. You just need to leave a remark in the general remarks section of your poll book saying what time you left during the day. And that way we know, okay, you weren't responsible for signing the back page. But everyone who's there at 8 o'clock needs to sign the back of the poll book. And then finally, the last thing that we're going to go over is the ballot summary. In the electronic poll book on the laptop, we've entered our ballot numbers, our starting and ending numbers at the beginning of the day. So in this precinct, we have 1,500 ballots that we are starting with. And then there were 952 ballots tabulated throughout the day. And all of these numbers get entered as we're doing it. So we enter the total number of ballots on the tabulator. If we've spoiled a ballot or rejected a ballot, that's already in the e-poll book, so that knows that, it counts that. And then at the very bottom, we put the number of ballots that we're left with. So if we've had 1,500 ballots to start, we have 1,000 ballots voted during the election, we should have 500 ballots left over. And if that's true, then this line down here, line L, will be 0, and we'll know that our precinct balances. So that's how we know that we've kept proper account of all of our ballots on Election Day. So let's see. The ballot summary itself looks like this. So this gets saved to a flash drive on the computer. This is something you'll go over more with your clerks if you're working the e-poll book. But essentially, this is the worksheet that gets filled out. You enter your starting and ending numbers in the morning, enter those same numbers in the evening, and then this worksheet allows you to fill in the ballots tabulated plus any spoiled or any other issues that happen to you throughout the day. If that number is not 0, if that's off for whatever reason, then that will have to be retabulated later on, or we'll have to figure out what caused that problem. That'll happen during the canvass after the election, probably in the week or so following the election. Okay. But does anybody have any questions on any of this? Okay. All right. Well, I did. Oh, yes. Sure. Oh, that's a good question. I would actually defer to your local clerks on that. The question was about a dress code for election inspectors. I would stay away from any candidate buttons, which I'm sure you would. But other than that, I would definitely defer to your local clerks. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. Yeah, it's a good question. Right. If you don't have any other questions, thank you all so much for coming out today. If you have anything that you want to just come up and ask me, feel free. I'll be sticking around. But thank you all so much for coming out today. Have a great election day.